What we want to do is do a comparison of exactly what you need to do from a marketing perspective to make the income you want to make. And unfortunately, I would easily say 95% of the doctors don't do this. They never pick an income they want to make, and they never put a plan together to go get it. I'd easily say, and from my experience, that's 95%. Most people just go, I want to make more money. They just go, I want to make more money, and they don't put a plan to it. And of course, that doesn't get you anywhere. So we're actually going to go over how to put the marketing plan together to get the money that you want to make. So let's start with the money you want to make first. And we're going to use some average numbers to do some calculations. So what is well, that's the very first thing you got to choose. And most doctors never choose that. They never choose that I want to make $100,000 a year or $200,000 a year. They don't even do that. And if you don't write it down, there's a 97% chance it will not be done. I don't know if you know of the Harvard study. They found pretty much that if you don't write down what you want, your goal, there's a 97% chance you're not going to get it. So there's a lot of components to goals, but one of them is writing it down. And that's why a marketing calendar is so important, by the way, also. You got to write down what you're going to do. There's got to be a blueprint to get to where you want to go. It can't just be hope and mirrors. So as an example, I remember when I first started in practice, I thought, man, it'd be great to make $100,000 a year. So that was my goal. I wrote down, I'd like to make $100,000 a year. And then I just kind of wrote down some of the things I'm going to do to get that. Well, now this was after I was trained and I knew what I was doing. I was surprised how easy that happened when I started my practice. Again, this was after I was trained. When I started my practice, it went from 0 to 100 visits a week in 60 weeks. And my first year, I profited $232,000. Now, I was only shooting for 100,000, but I profited 232. So I'm going, okay, well, what's next? Did I just want to stay there? Well, to be honest with you, I was kind of bored. I had real low overhead. My overhead at that time was 16%. It was real low. So the national average is 50%. So I thought, well, I was bored seeing 120 visits a week, something like that. And I'm like, well, let's get busy. Since I'm here, I might as well get busy. So then I started cranking up the business. And I go, well, instead of 100,000, let's shoot for 250,000. Well, that happened immediately. And I go, okay, what now? In other words, was 250,000 ever on my radar when I started chiropractic? Never. I never thought I'd ever make $250,000 a year. It was not even on my radar. And then I make 250 and I go, well, what now? I go, well, let's shoot for 500. I didn't do too big of a, in other words, if I would have tried to go from 0 to 500,000, I'd have probably fell on my face because it was too much. I'd had too much negative feedback and I'd been trying to do too much. So going incrementally was a large part of this also. So I go, okay, well, let's do 500,000. And then I put in place the plan. What do I need to do to make $500,000 a year? Now, let me just say a couple things about money. Number one, when we talk about $500,000 a year, the industry standard is that you always talk about it as after overhead. So you'd never say, I make $500,000 a year and you haven't included overhead. That's not how the industry talk is. It's always after overhead, before taxes. That's how money is talked. When people go, I make $80,000 a year, 70, it's always after overhead, before taxes. Okay, so let's be clear of where we're at first with money. So when I say I want to make $500,000 a year, it's after overhead. Well, the overhead's 50%. So we're going to include in 50%. So if I wanted to make 500,000 a year, I had to collect $1 million. And what's important is collection, not production. In other words, real money. Production's fake money. So we want to make sure we're collecting real money, not fake money. So I said, and I still remember this. As a matter of fact, I still have the legal pad. I wrote this down on a legal pad. I still have the legal pads of all the goals and the incomes that I wanted over like a 10-year period as I was growing my business. I wrote it down. I wrote it down where I was at, where I wanted to go, and then how I was going to get there. Is there any reason now you can see why I ended up opening 77 offices in 20 states? It was not an accident. It was a clear path and clarity of how to get from point A to point B. And then when I met point B, I just took the same formula and I adjusted it up. So then I did 500. Well, I did 500,000 immediately. There was not one year that went by that I did not meet that financial goal that I set. Now, did I need to make $500,000 a year? No. Now it just became a challenge. Now it was just challenging. It was something to do, something to chase after. It was a sense of achievement, helping people. It was just fulfilling to grow. That's what it was. And of course, you get all the byproducts from the money, which is fine. Okay, but did I ever want a private limo? No. Did I ever want a second home in Florida? No. Did I ever want a 40-foot yacht? No. These things just happen as you grow. You allow yourself, and a lot of people don't. A lot of people do not allow themselves to expand mentally. There's a lot of chiropractors that are just flat out stuck. And they've been stuck there quarter after quarter after quarter after quarter, year after year after year after year. And this is why. I'm just sharing you right now the core reason why. They don't pick what they want. They don't put a plan in place to do it. And they don't have a good reason why to go get it. Those are the three reasons it doesn't happen. So number one is you actually have to pick the money you want. You have to actually pick it. So after I picked 500,000, I made that. I go, well, let's just go for $1 million. Then I went for $1 million. And then I went from $1 million to $2 million. I said, well, let's go for $2 million. And that's how it all happened. That's how I kept growing from one office, only wanting to make $100,000 a year, to doing 77 offices in 20 states, collecting $90 million a year. I didn't start off that way. I just allowed myself to grow and I put a plan in place to do it. That's it. Now, so number one is you've got to pick the money. And a lot of people are afraid to pick the money. And they won't write it down. Or it'll be grossly too much. In other words, it'll be a target that they won't obviously be able to attain, which allows for you to quit. So a lot of these components become very important. You can miss one of these components, like shoot too big, create a lot of negative feedback, and you'll quit. And sometimes you'll quit the rest of your life. You won't even try again. So some of these topics are invaluable, like short-term steps, achievable steps. That's huge. Now, the next category is why. And this is a huge, this is the motivation of why you're going to do it or not. Why? Why do you want to make 100,000? Why do you want to make 500,000? Why do you want to make $1 million? Well, when you're in survival and security, you don't need a why. That alone is self-motivation. When you're trying to put a roof over your head, food in your stomach, security in your environment, that's enough for most people to get off their ass and do something. That's natural motivation. That's not the problem. The problem is when chiropractors hit that. And you can hit that seeing 70 visits a week, and it depends on what other sources of income you have. If your wife's making a good income, that could be a lot less. You could putz out at 40 visits a week and have no more natural motivation. So again, are you in survival or security? That a lot is what drives. I was just talking to a doctor. He was seeing 70 visits a week, renting. He's been stuck in there. He was thinking about getting out of chiropractic. Well, see, that created natural motivation for him to act and get out of that, for him to actually do something differently than what he was doing. That was natural pain, natural motivation. Well, as soon as you start making X amount of money and you get out of survival and security, that's when 80% of the people puts out, because natural motivation goes away for 80% of the people. Only 20% of the people have what's called internal pain, that they'll keep driving and driving, even though everything's covered. Their survival, their food, their shelter, they're in abundance. They'll still keep driving. I was one of those guys. It didn't matter how much money I made. I was still going to drive. I was still going to push. There's only about 20% of the population that's like that. And it's built in. And it's actually, and I talk about this totally separately when I talk about what creates motivation, is that it was imprinted motivation as a child. But that's not 80% of the population. Now, how do you know if you're one of those people? Well, did you putz out? Have you plateaued quarter after quarter and you're doing nothing to change it? You're that 80%, which means the next topic becomes very important. The why. Why do you want to make that money after you're out of security? That's going to be the single most important factor because it'll determine if you're going to act or not. It'll determine if you're going to change your habits. The why. So what are the components of why? Well, number one, the reasons we do things, number one, is for money. Well, that's great if you're in survival and security, and you should do it for money to get out of survival and security, because that's what money will do. It'll create survival and security. So when you're at that low of a level, doing something for money is important, and it's good to do it for money to get some stability in your life. Okay. Now, once that happens, what's the next reason? Personal gain. Well, personal gain's not real strong. Personal gain, and do you want a Lamborghini? Do you want a boat? It's not real strong. It's not real strong. A lot of people won't succeed very much in life because of personal gain. It's not a very strong motivator. The next level is conviction. That's a high motivator. Now, we only get conviction in two ways. Either from a personal, emotional experience, like me. I was helped by a chiropractor when I was 15 years old. Medical doctors couldn't help me at all from a tailbone injury. I went for months. They couldn't do anything. I went to a chiropractor, and in 3 treatments in 5 days, I was 100% normal. And that's without any medication, surgery, nothing. You can't tell me chiropractic doesn't work. It allowed me to sit down again as a 15-year-old with no pain. So you get conviction in 2 ways, either a personal experience. Now, obviously, the deeper the personal experience, the higher the conviction. Now, is that personal experience affecting your survival or security? That'll create a deep conviction. If it's just stopping you from playing Little League baseball, it's not going to affect your conviction that much. Okay. The second way is studying it over time. And I give the analogy with religion all the time. Some people, they just hit rock bottom and man, they just switch over and they find God. That's not most people. Most people eventually seek out God, and then they go to church and they more and more, and they've developed friends and build their network. And then they study it over time, and they become more spiritual, more aware, more self-enlightened over time. So that's the other way to help conviction, is to study something over time. And this is what I did with my associate doctors. They typically come in and were terrible with understanding the science of the 3 phases of healing and how chiropractic helps. They couldn't even explain it to an average person. And this was after they graduated. So I had to spend a lot of time on conviction. So we had to study the 3 phases of healing a lot. We had to do a lot of case analysis, comparing the cases and the biomarkers and they had to experience it. So it took about 3 to good 6 months for me to develop a real high conviction with my doctors with what they were doing with chiropractic physical medicine, what was actually happening scientifically relative to the science of healing. And then being able to equate that relative to the patient's test and biomarkers. And as the patient went through the 3 phases of healing, what biomarkers showed up, and so what were the appropriate tests to do and why physiologically. It took me 3 to 6 months to increase somebody's conviction to where they're like, yeah, I got it. We understand the 3 phases. Here's the 3 phases. Here's the biomarkers here, which this would be the therapy that I would help scientifically with that. Here's the biomarkers here. This is what I'd help scientifically with that. And here's the biomarkers in the 3rd phase. And this is how I'd help scientifically. Okay. So that's how I created strong chiropractic, a belief system. Now that was important because there's only 8% utilization. And if you don't have a conviction system, you're not going to be very strong in marketing. Matter of fact, you won't even want to ask for referrals because you don't even believe it that much. But once you understand it and believe it, and you're like, no, this really helps people, and it's very unique, and it's the only profession that actually affects the healing in all 3 phases. And if you don't, the person ends up having a permanent problem to some degree. Once you understand that, it is no problem talking about chiropractic and how it helps and works and getting new patients. Matter of fact, there's a motive to do it. And it's not a money motive. It's just, I want to help people because I know they're going to have permanent problems if they don't to some degree. So anyway, which gets us to the 4th reason, self-actualization. Now that's when you do it for a higher cause. That's when there's a cause bigger than you. And by the way, this is why doctors that believe in subluxations are so strong. It's almost cult-like. It's like a religion. This is why, because it's no longer about money, personal gain, or conviction. It's about a bigger calling. This is why you see subluxation, some of these subluxation doctors you would think of them as maniacs. Well, it's called self-actualization. They're doing it for a higher calling. Matter of fact, they know this when they go to seminars. That's why they'll teach everybody in the seminar. They'll say, you're saving lives. That's why they'll do that, is to take them to a higher calling. Why take them to a higher calling? Because then they'll have the conviction to give the recommendations, to be able to talk about the money, to create referrals. They'll have the ability to do all that because it's a higher calling. It's a higher calling. Self-actualization. So you got to pick the money first. And then it's got to be for somewhat of a strong reason. And I'll give one example. I had one doctor, and I'll move on from this and actually start calculating this up. But this is why doctors do not excel. I can look at one doctor who is not increasing his business from quarter to quarter. And I can almost guarantee it's one of these 3 things. They have not picked a specific money. They don't have a plan to put it there. And they don't have a good reason, high motivating reason to do it. That's the absolute 3 reasons they're stuck quarter after quarter after quarter after year after year after year. That's why. You can see it over and over again. And the doctors who do change and grow, what do they have in common? They know what they want. They have a plan in place. If they don't have a plan, they hire somebody like me to teach them the plan, to get them from point A to point B. In other words, they go out of their way to learn how to do it, and then they have a good reason. Now, a lot of times when they come to me, the reason is to get out of survival and security because they're not doing well. They're renting, they're driving a 5-10-year-old car, they're renting an apartment, and they're wondering why they got a $200,000 student loan. And they're seeing, 60 visits a week or something. Well, that's survival. That's a very different reason. So understanding it. So as an analogy, if you can't do this on your own, in other words, if you don't understand this, you don't apply it. So let's say you're one of the 80% that putzes out after survival and security. In other words, how do you know that? Because you're not willing to do anything different from quarter to quarter. That's how you know you're one of those people. That's how. Now, when you're the person that's willing to change and grow and spend time or money and learn and change, you're not one of those people. You're eventually going to get there. So it may be a different route, or you can hire somebody like me who's done it and go from point A to point B fast, or you can go through experience and waste a lot of time or money and take a lot of time and all that, before you eventually get a little higher. That's the difference that mentors make. It takes you from point A to point B the fastest versus experience. So anyway, this doctor puts out, zero motivation. He's seeing, I think, 100 visits a week, roughly. He's making about $150,000 a year. Plus his wife is a blue collar worker. She's making about 30 or 40. So, he's making $150,000 to $250,000. Well, he's definitely out of survival or security, and he's not one of the 20%ers. So he totally putzes out. So were we able to work with him? Well, I had to find his self-actualization. So I had to interview him. First, he had to understand this process. I go, personal gain is not going to do it. You're not going to do shit for the money. At that level, you're not going to change anything for the money. Conviction definitely helps. I said, we need to go to self-actualization. We need to do it for a higher calling, a higher cause. So I had to interview him to find out what he cared about, what he immensely cared about that was like tugging at him. Well, I found out that he really respected his father-in-law. He did not want to let his father-in-law down. Now, that's partly why he pushed to get to where he was, because he was a success. He was doing more than the average chiropractor, but he putzed out. So that feeling, that part of that feeling pushed him to get to where he was, that he didn't want to let his father-in-law down, that he's taking care of his father-in-law's daughter. See, that's huge. That affects a lot of people, which is great. Okay, so then he putzes out. So now I'm going in to find out what we could tie into. Now, you've got to be able to find this out on your own if you don't have somebody that can help you. You've got to look at yourself. And so we find out that his father-in-law. So I said, here's what we're going to do. Let's plan what we're going to do with your practice. Like whatever, I forget what the exact numbers are. Let's take it up to 200 visits a week. So it makes this amount of money, 200. Well, there was no reason behind it because we'd been talking about that for a year. It was worthless. He wasn't willing to change anything for a year, even though he wanted to make more money, blah, blah, blah. Okay. It wasn't till there was a reason, a high conviction, self-actualization reason, that he was willing to change his actions. And so we connected the money, and we said, well, why don't we found out that their parents really like doing cruises. I said, I'll tell you what, why don't we connect your growth to you buying them a cruise? Because I already know he didn't want to let them down. He valued his father-in-law, and we wanted to give something they valued. So we said, well, let's give them a week-long cruise, and you make the announcement. Matter of fact, you give it to them in a card saying you get a week-long cruise as soon as I hit 200 visits a week. And I said, we're going to come up with the plan, how we're going to take your practice from your 100 plus visits a week to 200. So we're going to do this, this, and this. In other words, what he was not willing to do. So we put the plan in place that would do it. That we'd done that a year before. He just wasn't willing to do it because there was no impetus. There was no good reason why. This is why people talk about purpose so much. Finding your purpose. Your purpose is what blasts you through barriers, which overcomes issues, which overcomes the no's, which overcomes the fears, the negative self-talk. It's called purpose. Purpose is self-actualization, doing it for a higher cause. Okay. And we put a time frame on it. We said, let's do it in 6 months. He did it in 60 days. 60 days. So we spent over a year trying to talk him into doing better, better, better. It was worthless. until we connected with his self-actualization. He didn't want to let his parents down. He didn't want to let his father-in-law down. And it was a limited time, and it was something they valued. And just like that, in 60 days, it was met. What was the whole difference? Purpose. So if you're not writing it down, you're not going to get it. If there's not a purpose, you're not going to get it. It can't be a weak purpose. I want a Lamborghini. Personal, that's worthless. That's a pleasure motivated, and it's worthless. So as another example with me, one of the things I did is I financed an 8,000 square foot wing onto the local church. I did that on purpose. So I had to cut the check for the mortgage. So I put that into the plan. So I go, okay, I have to make this, got to put it into the plan, because this is what it's going to cost monthly to build an 8,000 square foot wing onto the church. Well, do you think I'm going to let the church down? I'll fight, kick, and scream before I let that church down. I'll be going out there and doing blood pressure screenings before I let that church down. That's the importance of why. You don't have a good why, you got nothing. You're just yapping. You're spinning your wheels. So these things have to be in place. You got to pick where you want to go first. Well, what do you want to make? Can't be too damn big. That'll create a lot of negative feedback and shut you down. Well, when I went for $100,000 out of school, that wasn't too big. And when I went from 100 to 200,000, that wasn't too big. If I'd have probably went from 100 to 500, that'd have been too big, or 100, that'd have been too big. I'd have been setting myself for rejection for what it would have taken to do that. So these are major concepts to get ahead in life. And you've got to understand them. You've got to control them, and you've got to apply them, unless you've got somebody else who's going to help you do it. And most people don't even understand how this works. They just get stuck, and then they blame everything else. They blame everything else except themselves why they're stuck. So number one, you got to pick your number and you got to write it down. Now, whatever it is, it's got to be twice, because your overhead's 50%. So if you want to make 100,000, it better be 200. You want to make $250,000, it better be 500. Okay. So you got to write it down. It's got to be twice for your overhead. There's got to be a reason. What's the single most important out of all of this? There better be a solid reason why you want to do it. Maybe you want to buy your wife a better house. You know, the house you're living in is very mediocre, maybe middle, lower class, blue collar. And you're like, man, my wife deserves money more than that. I want to take care of my wife and my family. See, that's a higher calling. I want my kids to go to private school. That's a higher calling. Not I want a Lamborghini. So you got to have a reason why you want to do it. It's got to be a high value reason called self-actualization or conviction. In other words, purpose. It's got to be a purpose. So what are you willing to fight for? That's what it's about. So next you come over. What's the next thing? You okay, I got my number. I got my reason. Well, what's missing? The plan. Go, how am I going to get there? That's what we're going to go through right now. We're going to walk through the plan. How are you going to do it?